Imagine this: a summer afternoon. In the marble square of Rome, a group of silent soldiers dig a shallow pit. No funeral, no mourning, just the stench of dried blood and a rotting human body. No one dares speak his name. They call him the Mad Boy, the silk draped monster. One soldier vomits at the sight, another spits on the corpse. What they dumped into that hole once sat on the throne of Rome, once was worshipped as the living sun god, once made an empire kneel to the lust and will of a child, Elagabalus, a name history tried to erase, not because he was weak, not because he failed, but because he was too dangerous to remember. That teenage boy shattered every limit of religion, morality, and power. He turned the world's greatest empire into a stage of decay where pleasure, blood, and madness were sacred. Why was a child given the crown? Why did Rome stay silent as he forced the Senate to join his twisted theater? And what finally made the city rise and tear him apart like a diseased dog? To understand Elagabalus, we must first understand the empire he inherited and the strange, dangerous family that placed him on the throne. Rome, in the early 3rd century, was not yet falling, but it was fracturing. The once mighty empire that had stretched from Britain to the deserts of Arabia was growing weary. Its borders were restless, armies were scattered, generals not senators held real power. Emperors came and went. Like autumn winds, many murdered, others forgotten. The imperial palace was no longer a symbol of divine rule, it was a nest of knives. Into this world came the Severan dynasty, an African born family from the province of Syria, wealthy, ambitious, and deeply entangled in the rituals of the East. Septimius Severus, the dynasty's founder, had clawed his way to power through war and political marriage. His son Caracalla ruled with terror and bloodshed and was eventually assassinated by his own men. Rome, exhausted by chaos, wanted stability. Instead, it got Julia Maesa. Maesa was not an empress. She was something far more dangerous, a grandmother. Sister of the empress Julia Domna, aunt to the late emperor Caracalla, and a priestess of the sun god Elagabal Maesa, wielded her family's Eastern religion like a weapon. After Caracalla's death, in the brief unpopular reign of the usurper, Macrinus Maesa saw her moment. She had a grandson, a beautiful boy with dark eyes, soft features, and the blood of emperors in his veins. His name was Varius Avitus Bassianus. He was just 14. But to Maesa, he was more than a child, he was a divine tool, a living image of the sun god. And if Rome wouldn't accept him by blood, they would be forced to kneel before his holiness. From the city of Emesa, a sacred city in Syria, known for its black meteorite idol of Elagabal Maesa, gathered her supporters. Soldiers loyal to Caracalla, priests who believed the boy was a living god. With bribes of gold and whispers of prophecy, she stirred rebellion in the east. In 218 AD, her army rose up, and the boy was declared the emperor by force. Macrinus tried to stop them. He failed. At the Battle of Antioch, the legitimate emperor was defeated, executed, his son hunted and killed, and just like that, the boy priest from Syria, not yet old enough to grow a beard, became ruler of the most powerful empire on earth. But Rome was not prepared for what came next. At first, they saw him as a curiosity, a new boy emperor, odd perhaps, but better than civil war. They called him Elagabalus after the sun god he served. He arrived in Rome, draped in silk, surrounded by eunuchs, priests, and exotic animals. He refused to wear the traditional toga. He would not eat Roman food. And every morning before attending court, He offered bloody sacrifices to his eastern god, burning incense flowers, and sometimes even animals, inside a sacred black stone he brought from Syria. Still, Rome tolerated him. They had seen stranger things. Caligula, after all, had once declared his horse a senator. But Elagabalus was no eccentric. He was a storm one that would rip apart centuries of Roman tradition, religion, and identity. He began by marrying a Vestal Virgin, an act so blasphemous that Roman law had prescribed death by burial alive for centuries. He appointed foreign priests to high office. He entered the Senate covered in makeup and perfume, laughing as senators turned pale. Behind the palace walls, rumors multiplied that he held orgies dressed as a goddess, that he forced nobles to attend erotic plays where they themselves were the performers. Still, this was only the beginning. Elagabalus did not want to rule Rome. He wanted to transform it, to melt it down, and rebuild it in his own chaotic image. An empire not of law, but of ecstasy, not of Rome's gods, but of his. And those who resisted, they would be destroyed not by sword, but by shame, spectacle, and sacrilege. It started with whispers. At first, Rome was entertained. The boy emperor was strange, yes, but after years of bloody coups, a little exoticism seemed harmless. His obsession with his god Elagabal was odd, but tolerable. His foreign dress, bright silks, gold earrings, even high-heeled shoes raised eyebrows, but few dared speak out. Rome had survived madness before. Surely it could endure this child's theater. But Elagabalus wasn't pretending. Every day the rituals grew more extreme. He had the sacred stone of Elagabal, a black meteorite worshipped in Syria, placed in a grand temple on the Palatine Hill. Then he declared it the chief deity of Rome, not Jupiter, not Mars. The Roman pantheon, centuries old, was shoved aside for a nameless Eastern god that drank blood and demanded ecstasy. And still Rome did nothing. Then came the marriages. Elagabalus was married 5 times in less than 4 years. One of his brides was a Vestal Virgin, Aquilia Severa, a sacred priestess born to 30 years of chastity. Their union was not just scandalous, it was sacrilege. It was a declaration of war on Rome's oldest religious laws, and Elagabalus didn't care. He laughed at the outrage, declared their marriage divinely approved, claimed he was uniting the masculine fire of the sun with the virginal purity of Rome, a sacred cosmic fusion. When the priests protested, he replaced them with his own. When the Senate begged him to stop, he responded with gifts, gold, silk, and the occasional humiliation. The court changed, the guards changed, the rules dissolved. Nobles who once governed provinces were now forced to dress as women at palace banquets. Eunuchs were given military rank. A former slave became the imperial charioteer. Dancers, actors, prostitutes, all elevated, all honored. And at the center of it all was the boy, not ruling, performing. He wore robes sewn with gems, breastplates shaped like a goddess's chest, and headdress veils like a bride. He insisted on being called not emperor, but empress, and sometimes queen of queens. He began seeking a husband. This wasn't rumor. Elagabalus publicly advertised that he was looking for the most well-endowed man in Rome to marry. He offered rewards. He interviewed candidates. One of his favorites was a blond charioteer named Heracles, whom he adored, worshipped, and called his husband. And still Rome watched in silence. But silence was not approval. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers, had begun to murmur. Senators exchanged glances behind closed doors, and Julia Maesa, the grandmother who had engineered his rise, now watched in cold horror as her creation spiraled out of control. This was not what she planned. She had hoped to control him, to rule through him. But Elagabalus could not be controlled. Every day brought a new scandal, a new public humiliation. And worst of all, he had no interest in governing. He refused to hold council meetings. He ignored laws, abandoned treaties, dismissed foreign envoys in the middle of conversations, unless they brought him exotic gifts or handsome male servants. He was turning Rome into a circus, and the lions were getting hungry. But Elagabalus didn't feel the danger. He believed he was untouchable, protected by divinity, adored by the people chosen by the gods. He had priests bathe him in perfumes, read omens and animal entrails, and conduct orgies in the temple of Elagabal. He released doves during sacrifices, set wild animals loose at parties, and filled fountains with wine. The people began to resent it, not just the decadence, the cost. Elagabalus had drained the treasury. He lavished gifts on his lovers, commissioned gold-plated chariots, imported snow from the Alps for summer feasts. And when that wasn't enough, he auctioned off palace furniture, thrones, statues, imperial heirlooms to pay for his pleasures. And still he did not see it coming. Julia Maesa did. She realized the boy could not be salvaged, that his reign, if allowed to continue, would destroy not just their dynasty, but the entire Severan legacy. And so quietly, she began to prepare another, her second grandson, younger, simpler, and most importantly, controllable. The plan was simple. Julia Maesa would keep her mad grandson on the throne for now, but plant seeds in the shadows. She began introducing the Roman people to another figure, a boy named Severus Alexander, Elagabalus's cousin, handsome, quiet, Roman in speech and dress. Where Elagabalus was chaos, Alexander was calm, a mirror held up to the madness. Maesa made sure Alexander was seen at ceremonies, in temples during state appearances, and the people began to murmur again. But now it was a different whisper. Why not him? Elagabalus noticed, and he did not forgive. The emperor's banquets, once filled with honeyed wine and song, became silent tents. He watched every glance, listened for every laugh not meant for him. He dismissed advisors on the smallest suspicion, tortured a palace servant who he claimed had smiled too fondly at Alexander. Paranoia bloomed. Surveillance became policy. He planted spies within his own household, had his guards' rooms searched. Senators were arrested for dreams of treason, confessed only under the crack of a whip. The prisons filled again. But it wasn't fear that undid him. It was spectacle. Elagabalus could not stop performing. Even as Rome shifted beneath him, he chased new shock, new pleasure. He ordered his palace turned into a temple brothel, where he, the emperor of Rome, offered himself to strangers dressed in silk and chained with golden bracelets. He paid men to beat him during rituals. He bragged publicly that he had invented new sex positions unknown to even the Greeks. The Senate was appalled, the guards disgusted, and still Maesa said nothing. She waited, until finally the emperor went too far, not with his body, but with his blood. In an act that stunned even his most loyal followers, Elagabalus declared his god, Elagabal, to be married to the goddess Urania, a local Syrian deity. A divine wedding was held, complete with public sacrifices, gold-drenched priests, incense fires, and the slaughter of hundreds of animals. The entire Roman court was forced to attend. Anyone who refused, including senators generals and respected philosophers, was exiled or quietly executed. It was no longer religion. It was tyranny disguised in sacred cloth. But in the shadow of the temple, a different kind of ceremony was happening. Julia Maesa, in secret, had struck a deal with the Praetorian Guard, the same men sworn to protect the emperor with their lives. She offered them money, land, power, and most importantly, peace. Not another Eastern boy god in makeup and pearls, but a Roman boy, a controllable boy, Severus Alexander. The conspiracy bloomed like rot in the walls. Meanwhile, Elagabalus grew increasingly unhinged. He paraded through the streets at night, disguised as a prostitute, soliciting men and mocking senators in public. He began inventing crimes just to see people flogged. Once during a dinner, he released panthers into the hall and laughed as guests screamed and clawed at the walls. The final insult came when he ordered the images of all Roman gods removed from the Senate house and replaced with his black stone idol, the meteorite of Elagabal. Even those who had tolerated him now understood Rome was not being led, it was being mocked. And so, in the winter of 221 AD, Julia Maesa made her move. She convinced Elagabalus, still clinging to the illusion of control, to adopt Severus Alexander as his heir. The emperor agreed reluctantly. The crowds cheered. For a moment there was calm, but it didn't last. Elagabalus saw how the people loved his cousin, how the guards saluted him a little too sharply, how the senators praised Alexander but only bowed to him. So he reversed the adoption, declared the boy a traitor, ordered his execution. But when he summoned the Praetorian Guard to carry it out, they refused. It was over. He just didn't know it yet. Elagabalus panicked, fled to the palace, begged his mother Julia Soamius to protect him. He tried to flee the city, but the gates were closed. Even the servants avoided his eyes. His divine power, the godhood he had wrapped around himself like a robe, was gone. And then came the knock. A detachment of Praetorians' faces. Blank demanded his presence at camp. He complied. He had no choice. He brought his mother, still in jewels, still believing herself untouchable. But as they entered the barracks, the gates closed behind them. There was no trial, no questions, only swords. In that final moment, Elagabalus screamed, not in terror but rage. How dare they touch him? He was divine, sacred, their god in flesh. He spat, he cursed. He called on Elagabal to strike them down. No lightning came. They stabbed him, repeatedly. His mother tried to shield him. She died first. He died second, and even then the soldiers weren't done. They dragged his corpse through the mud, tore the earrings from his ears, kicked in his teeth, stripped him naked, and tied his body to a cart. It was hauled through the streets, spat on, stoned, mocked, and finally dumped in the Tiber. No tomb, no grave, no name. The emperor who once called himself the living sun god was now sewage floating among the filth of the city he tried to remake in his image. The boy had once stood above the world, perfumed, adored, shining like the sun itself. Now he hid in the dark. Rome had turned on him. The palace walls whispered betrayal. The Praetorian guardmen, once paid to die for him, no longer answered his calls. And Julia Maesa, the grandmother who made him emperor, no longer returned his gaze. Only one person stayed his mother, Julia Soamius. Even as the city spat out his name, she brushed his hair. She told him it would pass, that the people didn't understand divinity, that Rome would learn to worship the sun, but she was wrong. The adoption of Severus Alexander had been a final compromise. When Elagabalus tried to undo it, when he ordered the boy's execution, the knife turned. The Praetorian Guard refused the order. They did not protest. They simply didn't move. No shouts, no speeches, just silence. That silence was fatal. Elagabalus felt it first. The way the air changed when he walked into a room, the way his guards no longer bowed with urgency, the way the city seemed to breathe without him. And so he ran, not from the people, but from the truth. In his final hours, Elagabalus dressed in the robes of a priest. He wore his heaviest jewelry, painted his face in the colors of the sun, and stood before the sacred black stone of Elagabal in his private temple. He begged, not for mercy, for vengeance. He demanded his God strike down his enemies, that fire consume the traitors, that the river flood the palace and cleanse Rome in holy flame. Nothing happened. Outside boots echoed against the cobblestones. The Praetorians came not with ceremony, but with purpose. They knocked once, then entered. Elagabalus tried to speak, tried to declare his divinity. But they did not kneel, they did not salute, they did not listen. He was no longer emperor, he was a target. They ordered him to come with them. No explanation, no farewell. He grabbed his mother's hand. She kissed his forehead. Together they were led into the night. They thought it was a summons, an interrogation, a punishment perhaps, but survivable. They were wrong. The guards led them to the barracks, the same place where emperors were crowned and sometimes ended. The doors shut behind them. There was no court, no words. The first sword struck Julia Soemius. She fell hard, her gold bracelets shattering across the stone. Elagabalus screamed not in power, not in rage, but in something we almost never hear from emperors' helplessness. He lunged forward, crying, bleeding arms outstretched, but the second blade hit his back. Then another, and another. They did not kill him quickly. He writhed. He gasped. He cursed and pleaded. His robes darkened with blood. One soldier kicked him to the ground. Another cut off his headdress. Still he lived, until one final thrust silenced everything. Elagabalus, the boy who declared himself a god who demanded Rome, kneel before his altar of desire, died with his face against the stone floor in a pool of his mother's blood. And the nightmare wasn't over. His body was stripped naked, the jewels torn off, makeup smeared into the dirt. A rope was tied around his ankles. They dragged him out not like a man, but like a slaughtered animal. The streets of Rome, still wet from morning rain, became his funeral procession. People lined the alleyways, not in mourning and mockery. Some threw rotten food, others stones. There were cheers, laughter, even songs. The emperor was dead, the whore emperor, the demon child. They dragged his corpse across the forum. His flesh tore on the cobbles. Bones cracked. No one stopped them. They reached the Tiber. There was no funeral, no rites, no pyre, just a splash, and then silence. The body of Elagabalus, emperor, priest, performer, sank into the filth of the river, where Rome dumped its garbage, its sewage, its shame. He would never be buried, never be named in public again. His face was scratched off statues, his laws burned, his name banned from inscription. Damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. It was not enough to kill him. He had to be forgotten. But the river does not forget, neither do the stones of Rome. Some said the water turned dark for days. Others claimed the cries of a boy could be heard at night, near the barracks calling out for his mother. The priests of Elagabal were purged, the temple torn down, the black stone was returned to Syria sealed away from Roman eyes, and yet some relics survived. A painting here, a whisper in a poem, a curse on a wall, a list of emperors with one name violently scratched out. He had ruled for just 4 years. 4 years of shock, sacrilege, sex, and spectacle. 4 years of rewriting what power could mean and how quickly it could rot. Elagabalus disappeared, but not completely. Rome tried. After his death, the Senate moved quickly to erase every trace. His name was outlawed. Statues were toppled. Coins were melted. His lovers were hunted. His laws were repealed. The temple he built was destroyed stone by stone. Official histories called him mad, depraved, insane. They said he never truly ruled, only disgraced, that he was not emperor, but a curse, an interruption. But erasure is never perfect. In dusty corners of ancient libraries, his name lingered buried in footnotes, side texts, and scandalized accounts written by men who could not believe what they'd witnessed. Ammianus, Herodian, Cassius Dio. They wrote not just with revulsion, but with awe, because what Elagabalus did had never been done. He didn't just challenge power, he tried to remake it. He declared himself sacred. He redefined gender, sexuality, and divine right, all while sitting on the most dangerous throne in the world. He blurred the lines between emperor and priest, between man and woman, between spectacle and rule. For a brief blinding moment, he ruled not by sword or law, but by shock. And that terrified Rome more than any war ever had. So they buried him not just in the river, but in silence. But silence breaks. Centuries later, historians found the pieces. His face scratched out on coins, his name carved over on inscriptions, manuscripts mentioning an emperor who called himself She, a teenager who wore a crown of gold and a dress of pearls. In the 20th century, Elagabalus resurfaced, this time not as a warning, but a question. Was he Rome's greatest disgrace, or its most misunderstood rebel? Was he mad, or simply unwilling to pretend writers, artists, and thinkers from across the world began to revisit his story? Antonin Artaud, Derek Jarman, Sylvia Plath. They saw not a monster, but a symbol of defiance, of transformation, of the cost of living outside every norm. Elagabalus became a mirror. For some, he reflected decadence. For others, freedom. For some, proof that Rome had been destined to fall. For others, proof that even at the heart of empire, a single soul could still rebel. And the questions remain. If he had lived longer, would Rome have changed, or would he have destroyed it? Was he a warning or a prophecy? History offers no answers, only echoes. The boy emperor who called himself a god, the god who was buried like a dog, the name erased, but never quite gone. Elagabalus was meant to be forgotten. Instead, he became unforgettable. He called himself the light of the world, but in the end he vanished in the dark. Elagabalus was supposed to be erased, written out of time, drowned in silence. And yet here you are, centuries later, still hearing his name, because some stories rot too loudly to stay buried. But if you think this was disturbing, you haven't met his successor. The boy who replaced him, Severus Alexander, was everything Rome wanted: obedient, polite, proper. He restored the temples, cleaned the throne, smiled where Elagabalus screamed. But even he would not escape Rome's curse, because the empire wasn't saved. It was only silenced, and what happened to Alexander was even more brutal. If you want to know how Rome treated its perfect boy, and how a well mannered child emperor ended up torn apart by the very soldiers who once kissed his ring click here. His story is quieter, but somehow even darker. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. We tell the stories they tried to erase.